Most people worry about what they'll leave behind for their family. I had to worry about what my family was trying to take before I was even gone. I spent 40 years building an empire from nothing, and I intended to protect it, especially from my own blood. The teller at my private bank has my number on speed dial for a reason. So when he called to tell me my daughter, Claire, and her parasitic husband, Marcus, were withdrawing $500,000 in cash, I simply told him to proceed. From a private office overlooking the marble floor, I watched them. I saw the greedy glint in Marcus's eye as he stuffed wads of my money into a briefcase. I saw the foolish, weak relief on my own daughter's face. They thought they were finally free. They had no idea their celebration would last exactly 97 minutes. They didn't know that in signing one minor trust document last week, they had just handed me the keys to their entire world. They thought they were stealing my money, but they had just walked into my trap. This is the story of how I took it all back. If you're ready for a story about cold, calculated family revenge, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Let me know in the comments what you think their first sign of trouble will be. The Sunday brunch was a tradition, a carefully preserved fossil from a time when our family felt less like a business arrangement and more like a bond. The late morning sun streamed through the solarium windows of my Greenwich home, glinting off the baccarat crystal and the heavy sterling silver I'd inherited from my mother. The air smelled of fresh freesias and the Belgian waffles my private chef, Anya, prepared just for Claire. My daughter, Claire, sat opposite me. She was beautiful, with my late husband's soft eyes and a fragility I once mistook for gentleness. Now I saw it for what it was: a lack of spine. Her gaze kept flickering toward her husband, Marcus, who sat beside her, holding court as if this were his table, his silver, his sun. "The opportunities in emerging tech are just staggering, Vivian," Marcus was saying, gesturing with a hand that wore a watch worth more than my first car. "You have to be bold. You have to be willing to seize the moment." I smiled, a placid, maternal expression I had perfected over the years. It was a mask. Inside I catalogued his words. Opportunity. To Marcus, the world was not something you build. It was something you grab. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with a familiar, hungry light. He was assessing, always assessing. He'd complimented the silver earlier, his thumb subtly tracing the hallmark when he thought I wasn't looking. "And Marcus has such a vision for it," Claire added, her voice breathy with admiration. She loved the life he promised her, a life of effortless luxury, funded of course by my outdated and unadventurous portfolio. I let the conversation drift, nodding in all the right places. I watched them operate as a unit. He, the predator, and she, the willing lure. The thought was a shard of ice in my heart, but my face remained serene. After Anya cleared the plates and served the coffee, I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. "Oh, that reminds me, darling," I said, my tone light and casual as I turned to Claire. "I've had Mr. Davies update some of the family trust paperwork. Just streamlining things for the future. Could you be a dear and stop by his office this week to sign them? It's a mere formality." Marcus's attention sharpened. I could almost see the dollar signs clicking behind his pupils. "Of course, Vivian," he said smoothly, placing a proprietary hand on Claire's arm. "We'll take care of it first thing Monday." "Wonderful," I said, the smile finally reaching my eyes. "It's so good to have family you can trust." Later that evening, the house was silent save for the quiet hum of the climate control. I sat in my study, a glass of Macallan 25 resting on the polished mahogany desk. This room was my sanctuary, the place I had built my empire. Every leather-bound book, every antique map on the wall was a testament to a life of hard work, strategic thinking, and, above all, control. My trust in my daughter had not eroded overnight. It was a slow, painful decay. It began with the little things. A story from Claire about a minor fender bender that didn't quite add up, followed by a quiet bill from a European auto body shop for $20,000. Then came Marcus's investment fund, a venture so exclusive it had no website, no prospectus, and no returns, only a steady drain from Claire's allowance. An allowance I provided. The final insult had been a call 3 months ago from a gallery owner in Soho, thanking me for my daughter's purchase of a hideous modern sculpture for $80,000. I had never authorized such a thing. When I confronted Claire, she dissolved into tears, blaming a misunderstanding. But I knew. She and Marcus were testing the waters, seeing how much they could take before the old lady noticed. That was when I called Mr. Davies. He had been my lawyer for 40 years, a man whose discretion was as solid as his knowledge of contract law. Together we didn't just draft a document, we designed a cage. The updated family trust was a work of art, 90 pages of dense legalese with one beautiful, brutal clause buried in a subsection on fiduciary responsibilities. The clause stated that any single, unauthorized cash withdrawal over $10,000 from a specific list of my personal accounts would be legally defined as a malicious breach of trust. The consequences were immediate and absolute. The signatory would be instantly disinherited, and any and all assets held by them within the trust, their home, their cars, their investment portfolios, would be forfeited and revert to my control. It was a weapon disguised as a legal document. 2 weeks ago, after confirming Claire still had signatory access, I transferred $500,000 into one of those accounts. A quiet, tempting pool of liquid cash. It was the perfect bait. Now, all I had to do was wait for the rats to get greedy. The call came at 11:15 a.m. on Tuesday. It was Robert, the manager of my private bank branch and a man who owed his career to a loan I'd given his father decades ago. "Vivian," he said, his voice low. "They're here. Your daughter and her husband. The withdrawal request is for the full $500,000. In cash." "Thank you, Robert," I said calmly, though my heart beat a little faster. "Proceed as we discussed. And have the car ready at the back entrance." I was there in 10 minutes. Robert escorted me to a private viewing office that overlooked the main floor. The bank was an institution of old money, all marble floors and hushed tones, a secular cathedral dedicated to wealth. Down below, framed by a thick pane of soundproof glass, was the teller's window. It felt like a stage, and I was watching the final act of a tragedy I had written myself. Marcus was practically vibrating with excitement, his back rigid, his hands clasped behind him. He was trying to look casual, but a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. Claire stood beside him, clutching her Chanel bag. Her face, which I knew as well as my own, was a mask of nervous anticipation. She wouldn't meet the teller's eyes. Then the money came out. Not in a neat cashier's check, but in thick paper-banded wads of $100 bills, just as they'd requested. It was a crude, vulgar display. Marcus's eyes widened. He grabbed the stacks greedily, stuffing them into a leather briefcase with none of the grace he usually affected. This was his true self, a smash-and-grab thief in a Tom Ford suit. They didn't linger. As soon as the last wad was in the case, they turned and walked briskly toward the exit, a triumphant smirk on Marcus's face. Claire followed in his wake, a shadow pulled along by his greed. I watched them disappear onto the street. I took a slow, deep breath, the cold, sterile air of the office filling my lungs. I pulled out my phone, a single number on speed dial. Mr. Davies answered on the first ring. "They took it," I said. My voice was even, devoid of emotion. "Execute." I didn't need to follow them to know what came next. I could picture it perfectly. They would go to Le Chardin, that overpriced French restaurant Marcus loved because it made him feel like a titan of industry. He would order the most expensive bottle of champagne on the menu, a 2008 Dom Perignon, and hold his glass high. "To us," he'd say, his voice booming with false confidence. "To seizing the day. To finally getting what we deserve." Claire would smile, a real smile this time, one of pure relief. The pressure of living up to my expectations, of maintaining a lifestyle on my terms, was finally gone. She wouldn't see that she had just traded one cage for another, far smaller one. "The down payment on the lake house is covered," Marcus would declare, already spending the money. "And I'm putting a deposit on the new Porsche Carrera. The silver one. They would laugh, giddy with the thrill of their transgression. They were free. They were rich. They had outsmarted the old woman. In the middle of their celebration, one of their phones would buzz. A blocked number. They'd share a look of annoyance and ignore it, silencing the phone and immersing themselves back in their fantasy of a glorious future. A future that, at that very moment, was already dead. The fantasy lasted for another 97 minutes. I know the exact time because Mr. Davies is nothing if not precise. Their unraveling would have begun with something small, a moment of public friction. After the champagne, the oysters, and the filet mignon, Marcus would have grandly presented his American Express black card to the waiter. A few minutes later, the waiter would return, his expression a perfect blend of apology and discomfort. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Thorne, but the card has been declined." Marcus's face would flush. "That's impossible. Run it again." "We have, sir." 3 times. A flicker of panic in Claire's eyes. Marcus, annoyed and embarrassed, would pull out a different card, a Visa Infinite. "Fine. Use this one." Longer pause. The waiter would return again. "My apologies, sir. This one as well." The first cold tendril of fear would snake around their celebration. As Marcus began to argue, his phone, and then Claire's, would light up. A text message from their personal bank, the one where they'd planned to deposit my money. "Alert. All account activity has been frozen pending a security review." And then the final fatal blow. The digital guillotine. An email would arrive in both their inboxes simultaneously. The sender was Davies and Finch LLP. The subject line was stark, formal, and utterly terrifying. Legal notification. Breach of trust agreement. The champagne would turn to ash in their mouths. The laughter would die in their throats. In the sterile quiet of my study, I pictured their faces, the dawning horrific understanding that their glorious new future had just been foreclosed. I had not taken something from them. I had simply let them give it all away. The thread was pulled. Now, all I had to do was watch it all unravel. Took them less than an hour to arrive. I heard their car, a Range Rover I technically owned, screech to a halt in the gravel driveway. The front door slammed open with a force that echoed through the foyer. I didn't move from my chair in the study. I simply swirled the amber liquid in my glass and waited. They burst in without knocking. Marcus was in the lead, his face a blotchy, furious red. Claire trailed behind him, her face pale and stained with tears, looking like a frightened child in the shadow of his rage. "What did you do?" Marcus spat, his voice tight and raw. He slammed his hands down on my desk, rattling the crystal glass. I didn't even flinch. I raised my eyes to meet his, my gaze as cold and hard as a winter morning. "I did nothing, Marcus. I merely set a stage. You and Claire wrote, directed, and starred in the entire production. This is insane. You can't just freeze our accounts. That money was a gift I believe you'll find," I interrupted, my voice dangerously soft. "A gift you gave back to me with interest." I gestured to a single manila folder placed perfectly in the center of my desk. "You should have read the fine print." Claire let out a sob. "Mother, please. There has to be a mistake. We can fix this." I finally turned my attention to her, and the feigned warmth I'd worn at brunch was gone. "A mistake?" "Yes. Was it a mistake when you lied about your allowance for 6 months? Was it a mistake when you helped him siphon money for his phantom investments? Was it a mistake when you stood beside him in my bank and watched him stuff my money into his briefcase?" "No, Claire. It was a choice. A series of them." I opened the folder. Inside was a pristine copy of the trust agreement. I slid it across the polished wood towards them. Their signatures, Claire's a looping, girlish script and Marcus's an arrogant slash, were on the final page. I'd had Mr. Davies highlight the relevant clause in yellow. "Page 47, Section 8B, I said, my voice clinical. "Breach of fiduciary duty. By signing that, you agreed that any unauthorized cash withdrawal over $10,000 would be considered a profound betrayal. One with consequences." I took a slow sip of my scotch. The house, cars, the stock portfolio I settled on you after the wedding. They were all assets of the trust you just breached. Legally, as of 11:17 a.m. this morning, they are no longer yours. Welcome to your new reality. I could picture their next move as clearly as if I were a fly on the wall. They would find a lawyer, some hungry attorney in a cheaper part of town, someone who would see their designer clothes and smell a big payday. They'd sit in his cramped office, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. Marcus would do the talking, framing the story with himself as the victim, the dynamic entrepreneur crushed by his cruel, dragon-like mother-in-law. Claire would sit silently, twisting the handle of her now useless Hermes bag. And the lawyer, a man named Peterson or something equally forgettable, would listen patiently. He would take their retainer, probably paid for with the cash still sitting in that briefcase, and make promising sounds. Then he would ask for the document in question. I could see the scene perfectly. The slow reading, the initial confidence in his face fading, replaced by a furrowed brow. He would read page 47 once, then twice. He would trace their signatures with his finger. "This is your signature, Mrs. Thorne," he would ask Claire. She would nod meekly. Then he would lean back in his creaking chair and sigh, the sound of a payday evaporating. "I'm sorry," he'd say, all business. "There's nothing I can do. This contract is ironclad. She didn't just outmaneuver you. She used your own signature as the weapon. You walked into a trap of your own free will. Legally speaking, she has you and everything you thought you owned. Revenge, I have found, is best served not only cold but also in public. Financial ruin was only the first course. Humiliation was the main." I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Eleanor Vanderbilt, the undisputed queen bee of Greenwich Society and the head of the Charity Gala Committee. I spoke to her in hushed, concerned tones, telling her of my profound disappointment in Claire and Marcus and their recent catastrophic financial mismanagement. I suggested it would be terribly embarrassing for them to attend the upcoming gala under the circumstances. The second call was to the chairman of the Oak Ridge Country Club, a man who valued his club's reputation above all else. I didn't need to say much. The words financial impropriety and potential scandal were enough. The effects were immediate. The invitation to the Vanderbilt Gala was rescinded via a curt email the next morning. Marcus's tea time at the club was mysteriously lost in the system. When they tried to make a dinner reservation, they were told the club was fully booked for the foreseeable future. Friends suddenly became strangers. Calls went to voicemail. Casual encounters at the gourmet market were met with averted eyes and cold shoulders. They had been part of an exclusive herd, and I, the lead matriarch, had marked them as sick. The herd, as it always does, was now pushing them out into the wilderness to protect itself. They were becoming social lepers, and their isolation had just begun. Their beautiful, trust-owned home must have started to feel like a prison. I imagined the fights, the vicious, circular arguments of 2 people trapped in a cage with the bars slamming shut. "This is your fault," Marcus would snarl, pacing the minimalist living room that was no longer his. "If you hadn't been so weak, if you knew how to handle your mother, we wouldn't be in this mess." And Claire, stripped of the manicured politeness that wealth had afforded her, would finally lash back. "My fault," she'd scream, her voice cracking. "You were the one who couldn't wait to get your hands on her money. You pushed me to do this. You and your stupid, greedy plans." The briefcase full of cash, their great prize, would be sitting on the coffee table between them. $500,000 that was now a toxic reminder of their failure. It couldn't buy back their reputation. It couldn't unsign the document. It was a stack of paper that had cost them everything. The sight of it must have sickened them. The alliance of greed was fracturing, cracking under the first real pressure it had ever faced. That night, sleep offered no respite. I found myself in the west wing of the house, in Claire's childhood bedroom. Her things were long gone, replaced by the sterile furniture of a guest room, but I could still feel the ghost of the little girl I had raised. I opened a drawer in the nightstand and pulled out an old photo album. I stopped at a picture of Claire at 16. She was beaming, wearing a ridiculously expensive dress I didn't recognize. The memory attached to it rose, unwelcome and sharp. It was the year I'd found a credit card statement with thousands of dollars in charges from boutiques I never frequented. When I confronted her, she'd sworn up and down she'd lost the card. She'd cried, her face a mask of perfect innocence. I almost believed her. But I found the dress a week later, hidden in the back of her closet. She had not only stolen from me, but she had looked me in the eye and lied with a composure that chilled me to my core. I had forgiven her then. I told myself it was a phase, a teenage mistake. I paid the bill, gave her a stern lecture, and we never spoke of it again. Looking back now, I saw my error. I hadn't forgiven a mistake. I had enabled a character flaw. I had taught her that there were no real consequences. I had papered over the cracks in her foundation. All Marcus had to do was come along and whisper promises of a life without rules, and the whole structure came tumbling down. I closed the album, the manufactured warmth of the photograph feeling like a lie. This wasn't just about the money or the corporate espionage Marcus had coaxed her into. This was about that 16-year-old girl and the woman she had become. My actions today were not cruelty. They were a correction. A painful, long-overdue lesson in consequences, delivered by the one person she never thought would issue them. A week after their social exile began, Claire came to me alone. She didn't storm in this time. She used the key she still had for the garden gate, appearing at the French doors of my study like a wraith. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and she had foregone her usual impeccable makeup. It was a calculated performance of a broken daughter. "Mother," she began, her voice trembling. "I've been doing so much thinking. About everything. I know what I did was wrong. Unforgivable." I remained seated, my hands resting on a financial report. I didn't look up. "Oh. And what specifically do you believe you did wrong, Claire?" She faltered, caught off guard. The money. Taking the money. I let Marcus convince me. "So your mistake was getting caught," I stated, finally meeting her gaze. My voice was flat, devoid of sympathy. "This isn't an apology, darling. This is a damage assessment. You've come here because the club has shunned you and your credit is ruined. You aren't sorry for the betrayal. You're sorry for the consequences." Tears welled in her eyes, real this time, but they were tears of frustration, not remorse. "That's not true. I'm your daughter." "You were my daughter," I corrected her gently, but with the finality of a closing vault door. "My daughter would not have stood by and watched a grifter plot to fleece her own family. You made your choice. Now, I suggest you learn to live with it." I turned back to my report, a clear dismissal. She stood there for another minute, shrouded in a silence more damning than any shouting match, before she finally turned and left. With the emotional appeal having failed, it was Marcus's turn. His methods, as expected, were far cruder. He went to the press. Or rather, the online equivalent. A sleazy digital gossip rag called the New England Tatler, known for its sensationalism. The article appeared on a Friday morning. Mr. Davies sent me the link without comment. The headline was plastered in a lurid, bold font. "Cruel matriarch ruins daughter's life over family dispute, says son-in-law." It was a masterpiece of narcissistic fiction. Marcus had painted himself as the devoted husband, trying to protect his gentle wife from her cold, calculating, and emotionally abusive mother. He spoke of my iron grip on the family fortune and my unreasonable demands. The bank withdrawal was framed as a desperate attempt by Claire to reclaim a small piece of her own birthright, to fund a business that I had cruelly refused to support. He was the hero, I was the villain. It was designed to create public sympathy and shame me into submission. It was a fool's gambit. Marcus made the classic amateur's mistake. He assumed I would be on the defensive. He didn't realize that I had been playing a different game entirely, one where his predictable moves were already accounted for. The day after his article was published, a far more reputable financial journal, one read by everyone who mattered in our circle, ran a different story. It was an anonymous, but clearly well-sourced piece on the intricacies of modern estate planning and the legal safeguards of family trusts. Didn't mention us by name. It didn't have to. It spoke hypothetically of a prominent family and a trust document designed to protect against undue influence from opportunistic spouses. It included redacted, but verifiable excerpts from a trust agreement. It was accompanied by an equally anonymous breakdown of a young couple's recent spending, showing over $1 million in luxury cars, jewelry, and vacations in the last year alone, all drawn from family accounts. The narrative flipped instantly. The Tatler article was now seen as a pathetic, transparent lie. Marcus wasn't a hero protecting his wife. He was the opportunistic spouse the second article had warned about. He hadn't just lost the battle. His own weapon had been turned against him, making him a public laughingstock. The checkmate was not just financial or social. It was now a matter of public record. With their public reputation incinerated, I decided it was time for the final truth. I sent a message to Claire, just a time and a date. I told her to come to my office in the city. Alone. She arrived looking gaunt, defeated. She sat in the chair opposite my desk, not with the defiance of our last meeting, but with the exhausted resignation of a soldier whose war is lost. "I assume you're here to dictate the final terms of my surrender," she said, her voice a monotone. "No," I replied, my voice quiet. "I'm here to tell you why you lost." I pushed a second folder across the desk. This one was thicker, bound in black. "You think this was about the $500,000? You think this was about your husband's vulgar spending or your own weakness? That was merely the final symptom, Claire. Not the disease." She opened it. Inside were photographs. Surveillance reports from a private investigator I'd hired 6 months ago. The first photo was of Marcus, shaking hands with Richard Sterling, the CEO of our biggest corporate competitor. The next was a shot of them at a quiet bar, a USB drive being passed between them. Then came the bank statements. Not mine, but offshore accounts in Marcus's name, showing deposits that correlated directly with the dates of those meetings. Finally, there were printouts of emails, forwarded from your home computer, containing proprietary data on my company's Q4 projections and development schedules. My life's work. Claire's face went ashen. She looked up at me, her mouth opening but no sound came out. "He was selling me out piece by piece," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "And you, my daughter, were his accomplice. That $500,000 you stole from the bank. It wasn't the crime. It was the confirmation I needed that your loyalty was completely, irrevocably gone. You stood in my house, ate at my table, all while you helped the man beside you try to gut the company that gave you everything. You didn't just break my trust, Claire. You tried to break my legacy. That was the final blow. The one from which there was no recovery. A story could be spun about money. A misunderstanding could be claimed. But the evidence in that black folder was absolute. It was treason. I didn't have to be there to know what happened when she returned to that house. The flimsy bond between her and Marcus, forged in greed and mutual ambition, could not withstand the weight of such a sickening truth. Their arguments about money would have seemed petty now, childish. This was about a betrayal so profound it tainted everything it had ever touched. I imagine her confronting him, holding the damning evidence. And I imagine Marcus, the cornered narcissist, doing what he always does. Denying, deflecting, perhaps even trying to blame her. But for Claire, the spell was finally, irrevocably broken. The charming, ambitious man she thought she had married was gone. In his place stood a common thief. A parasite who had not only used her to get to my money but had also turned her into an agent in the destruction of her own family. The foundation of their life together was a lie. With the money gone, the social standing obliterated, and the truth of his character laid bare, there was nothing left. Later that week, my housekeeper, who still had a key, quietly informed me that the closets in the master bedroom were half empty. Marcus's clothes, his expensive shoes, his entire presence, were gone. Claire had finally thrown him out. My revenge was complete in one sense. The hostile entity I had targeted had been fractured, its two halves now turning on each other in a pit of their own making. The assets were liquidated with brutal efficiency by Mr. Davies. The house, with all its cold, minimalist furniture, was put on the market. The Range Rover and Marcus's ostentatious sports car were repossessed and sent to auction. It was a complete dismantling of a life built on my foundations. I did not have to watch Claire's descent. Reports filtered back to me. She stayed with a friend from college for a few weeks, then moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in Stamford, a place anonymous enough to hide her shame. The Hermès bags and designer clothes appeared on luxury consignment websites. I saw the diamond tennis bracelet Marcus had bought her with my money listed for a fraction of its value. Sold in a day. For the first time in her 32 years, my daughter had to find a job. After weeks of searching, she was hired as a sales associate at a high-end boutique, a place where she once shopped without looking at the price tags. I could picture her there, folding cashmere sweaters and offering wealthy women champagne, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had once been hers. It was a harsh, humbling new reality. There were no trust funds to cushion her, no powerful mother to call. There was only the quiet, unforgiving rhythm of a life she now had to earn, 1 hour at a time. Months later, as autumn began to chill the air, she was waiting for me on the sidewalk outside my city office building. The change was startling. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple dark coat and jeans. She looked thinner, and the exhaustion in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, hollowed-out clarity. She didn't ask for money. She didn't cry. She just stood there as I approached, forcing me to acknowledge her. "I just have one question," she said, her voice steady but brittle. "Why didn't you just talk to me? Before all of this? Why didn't you just tell me you knew, and give me a chance to fix it?" It was the question of a child who still believed that consequences were negotiable. I stopped and looked at my daughter, perhaps for the last time as a mother would. I saw the woman she was, not the girl I wished she had been. "I spent your entire life showing you right from wrong," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument or appeal. "I showed you the value of integrity and hard work. I taught you that a good name is the only currency that truly matters. A daughter who still needs to be told not to betray her own mother is no longer the daughter I raised." I held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement of the final, impassable gulf between us. Then I turned and walked into the building, leaving her alone on the sidewalk with my answer. The war was over. My company was secure. My legacy was protected from the likes of Marcus and his ilk. I had won. But victory is a cold companion. My house, once a bustling hub of family tradition, was now a silent monument to my success. The echoes of Sunday brunches were gone. The hallways felt wider, the rooms emptier. In the evenings I would sit in my study, the command center of my revenge, and find myself staring at old photographs. Claire as a gap-toothed 7-year-old on her first pony. Claire at her Yale graduation, her face bright with a promise she had failed to keep. Did I feel regret? Well, regret is for those who wish they had chosen a different path. My path was necessary, but I felt the weight of it. The profound, aching sorrow of a gardener who, in order to save the garden, had to rip out her own rose bush by the roots. I had purged the poison from my life, but in doing so, I had also confirmed my solitude. It was the price of my peace. There was one last piece of business. The assets seized from the trust, the value of the house, the cars, the stocks, and the $500,000 in cash that Mr. Davies had recovered, totaled just over $7 million. It was a sum that could have been quietly reabsorbed into my own fortune. But that was never the point. I established a new foundation. Not in my name but in my mother's. The Thorne Matheson Foundation for Women in Business. Its mission was simple: to provide seed capital, grants, and mentorship to female entrepreneurs who had a vision but lacked the means. It was for the women who, like me, were determined to build something of their own. It was my final statement on the matter. The money Claire and Marcus had tried to steal out of weakness and greed would now be used to empower generations of strong, self-reliant women. The legacy they had tried to tarnish would instead be forged into a new one, built on the very principles they had disdained. The first snow of winter is falling outside my study window, blanketing the manicured lawns in a sheet of pristine, silent white. Everything is clean. Everything is still. My victory did not bring me joy, but it brought me clarity. I purged the rot from my family tree, even though it meant pruning my only branch. I am alone, the undisputed queen of a silent castle, but the silence is no longer filled with the static of betrayal and anxiety. It is simply peace. I chose to protect the empire I built over the family that would have destroyed it. It was a hard choice, a lonely choice, but it was mine. I look out at the falling snow, at the quiet legacy I have both preserved and created, and I feel no remorse. I am ready to face the coming years on my own terms, finally and completely at peace. And so, the war is over. My legacy is secure, written in stone, not stolen by weaker hands. But the halls of this great house are silent. It's the price of victory, and a price I was willing to pay. Now I'm turning the final judgment over to you. I want to see your verdict in the comments below. There are only 2 choices, so tell me where you stand. Type #Team Vivian if you believe she was a brilliant strategist who did what was necessary to protect everything she built. Or type #Team Claire if you believe that despite the betrayal, a mother's revenge should never ever go this far. Who was right? You decide. Thank you for reading.